The night was quiet, too quiet for someone who had everything yet nothing at all. She sat in her enormous living room, surrounded by walls of glass that revealed a glittering city she had built herself into. People down there whispered her name with respect, some with envy, some with fear. To the world she was powerful, untouchable, the woman who had turned nothing into a fortune. But in the silence of her penthouse, where no laughter echoed and no voice answered back, the truth pressed down heavy: she was alone. Not the kind of alone that comes when someone leaves for a day, but the kind that becomes a lifestyle, a habit, a prison. Her fortune had not come free. Every coin, every deal, every success had taken a piece of her heart. She had long told herself it was worth it, that solitude was the natural price of greatness. Yet tonight, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, the silence felt sharper, as if it cut into her skin. She poured herself a glass of wine and let it sit untouched on the table. Her reflection in the window looked back at her, a woman polished on the outside but hollow in the middle. She tried to convince herself she was fine, that she didn't need anyone, but the truth was bitter. The deeper the silence grew, the more it reminded her of what she had given up to sit on her throne. It was then, just as she settled into her own thoughts, that it happened. A sudden knock at the door. Firm. Unexpected. The sound startled her so badly that the glass of wine tipped, spilling dark red across the polished marble floor. She froze. Nobody ever knocked at her door. Not without warning, not without layers of security. Her world was built to keep people out, and yet, here it was, someone insisting to be let in. Her heart pounded as she rose from the couch, not with fear but with a strange, electric curiosity. She approached the door slowly, each step echoing in the cavernous room, and placed her hand on the handle. For a moment she thought of ignoring it, retreating back into her carefully curated solitude. But something stronger than her fear pulled at her. When she opened the door, time seemed to fold. There, standing in the doorway, was someone she thought she would never see again. A face tied to her past, a face that once made her heart feel alive before she buried it beneath ambition. The woman looked older, wiser, but her eyes were exactly the same, soft, searching, full of something she hadn't felt directed at her in years. For a long second, neither of them spoke. The city lights behind them blurred, and it felt as if the world was holding its breath. Then, almost too softly to hear, the visitor said her name. Not the one the media used, not the polished title printed on business magazines, but her real name. The one that carried childhood, laughter, secrets, and an intimacy that cut deeper than any fortune. Her chest tightened. Memories came rushing back, ones she had forced herself to forget. She remembered nights spent talking until sunrise, dreams shared without shame, hands brushed together that had once meant more than friendship. And here she was again, in her doorway, as if the universe had cracked open a moment of mercy. She tried to speak but her throat caught. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, not anymore. She lived in a world of contracts, handshakes, and sharp smiles. Yet under the weight of that gaze, her carefully built armor threatened to crumble. "Can I come in?" the woman asked, voice trembling but steady enough to break through the wall of silence. Against all the habits she had lived by, she stepped aside. The sound of footsteps entering her home felt louder than the hum of the city below. It wasn't just someone walking into her penthouse, It was someone walking back into her life. And as the door closed behind them, the air changed. The solitude that had always felt permanent suddenly cracked, leaving her unsettled, uncertain, but undeniably alive for the first time in years. The silence after she closed the door was thick, but it wasn't the kind of silence she was used to. Usually, her home echoed with emptiness, a cold quiet that reminded her of how high she had climbed and how far she had distanced herself from anyone who once mattered. But now, with someone else standing inside these walls, that silence shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with tension, unspoken words, and the faint sound of breathing that wasn't hers. She could feel the presence of this woman as if it pressed against her skin, as if the room itself had drawn closer to listen. She moved to the living room slowly, unsure of what to do. Hosting wasn't something she had done in years, her home was designed for solitude, not for company. Yet the other woman followed her naturally, her steps soft, almost hesitant, like she knew this space wasn't used to welcoming anyone. They sat, not across from each other like strangers, but at an angle that made their eyes meet whether they wanted to or not. She could see time etched in the lines of her face, but none of it dulled her beauty. If anything, the years had carved strength into her features, a depth that hadn't been there before. She had the kind of presence that made you feel seen, even in silence. For a moment neither spoke. It wasn't awkward, it was something else, something heavier. The air seemed to hum with all the things that could be said but weren't yet. She found herself fidgeting, running her finger along the rim of a glass she hadn't touched. She hated how nervous she felt. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. In the world outside these walls, she was untouchable. She made men twice her age stumble over their words, made entire boardrooms bend to her will. But here, with her, she felt small, exposed, almost vulnerable. Then came the sound of laughter. Soft at first, like a memory rising to the surface. It slipped out when the other woman noticed the spilled wine still staining the marble floor from when she had been startled earlier. She looked at it, then at her, and shook her head with a smile that was both amused and affectionate. That smile broke something in her chest. She hadn't heard that sound in so long, hadn't seen that expression aimed at her in years, and the familiarity of it rushed back with an ache so sharp it almost hurt. Against her own will, she felt her lips curve, just slightly. It wasn't the polished smile she used for interviews and cameras, it was real, small, unguarded. And she hated how good it felt. They began to talk, slowly at first, carefully like people testing water they weren't sure was safe. The conversation started simple, questions about life, about where the years had gone. But beneath every word, there was something else, something unsaid. Each answer pulled at threads of the past, each glance lingered too long, hinting at feelings buried but not gone. When she spoke, her voice carried pieces of stories she hadn't shared with anyone else. Struggles, choices, the quiet pain of being misunderstood. And she listened, really listened, in a way no one else ever did. That was what unsettled her most. In her world, people listened because they had to. They listened because of her money, her influence, her power. But this woman, she listened because she cared. Because she always had. It was disarming, and dangerous. At one point, the conversation slipped into a memory, something small but vivid. A late night long ago when they had sat on a rooftop, sharing dreams they never thought would come true. She had almost forgotten it, but hearing it spoken out loud brought back the taste of the air, the warmth of a hand brushing against hers, the way she had felt like she could tell her anything. That memory made her chest ache. She tried to push it away, tried to remind herself of the walls she had built. She told herself she couldn't afford this. She had everything to lose. But when she looked up and saw those eyes watching her, soft and steady, all those defenses felt flimsy. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to let go, just a little, to stop being the woman who controlled everything and just be herself. But the thought scared her. Fear pressed heavy in her stomach, fear of what it would mean to open that door again, fear of being broken in ways she didn't think she could survive. Yet she couldn't deny the way her pulse raced, the way her skin seemed to buzz just being near her. She hadn't felt that in years, maybe ever. As the night stretched on, their words became easier, laughter slipped out more freely, and for a fleeting moment she forgot the fortress of solitude she had built around her life. She forgot the price she thought she had to pay for her fortune. She forgot the emptiness of the room that usually swallowed her whole. All she could feel was this presence, this warmth sitting across from her, reminding her of a part of herself she thought had been buried forever. And when the conversation fell into a comfortable silence again, she found herself staring at the way the city lights reflected in her eyes, and she realized with a pang of fear and longing that she wasn't ready for her to leave. The days that followed didn't feel like her usual life anymore. Normally her mornings began in silence, with the soft hum of the city beneath her windows and the cold taste of black coffee reminding her of how alone she really was. But now there was a different rhythm, a disruption she hadn't expected yet couldn't resist. She found herself waiting for the sound of footsteps in her hallway, for the low warmth of a voice that seemed to soften the edges of her world. It wasn't supposed to be this way. She had built her empire on discipline, routine, and the conviction that solitude was her greatest strength. Yet now solitude felt heavy, almost unbearable, once she knew what it was like to have company again. They began spending more time together, and though the world outside spun as usual with contracts and meetings and endless demands, inside her walls it felt as if time slowed down. Conversations stretched late into the night. Sometimes they spoke of the past, memories half buried but alive enough to sting. Other times they spoke of nothing at all, filling the hours with small stories and laughter that spilled out without permission. Each word chipped away at the armor she had worn for so long. She realized she had missed the sound of someone else breathing in her home, the simple comfort of another presence beside her. But with that comfort came fear. She had lived so long convincing herself she didn't need this, that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, that people were unpredictable and fragile while money and success were steady and safe. Letting herself lean into these feelings felt like betraying the rules that had carried her this far. And yet, every time their eyes met across a table or in the quiet glow of the city lights, her heart betrayed her. It beat faster, louder, as if reminding her of what she had denied all these years. She caught herself studying small details, the way her smile curved differently when she was amused versus when she was trying to hide her sadness, the way her voice softened when she spoke of things she cared about, the quiet strength in her posture that seemed unshaken by the years apart. Each detail drew her in, no matter how hard she tried to resist. At night, when she was finally alone in her bed, she would lie awake staring at the ceiling. Thoughts chased her in circles. Was this real? Was she strong enough to face it? Could she risk letting someone close only to lose them again? Loneliness had been painful, yes, but at least it was safe. It couldn't betray her. It couldn't walk away. But love was dangerous. It demanded surrender, and surrender was something she didn't know if she could give. One evening, they shared a quiet dinner together, nothing extravagant, just a simple meal at her long dining table. For years that table had sat untouched, more decoration than furniture. Now it felt alive with the clink of cutlery, the rise and fall of voices, and the warmth of laughter that filled the air like music. She found herself staring across at her, wondering how something so ordinary could feel so extraordinary. At one point, their hands brushed by accident while reaching for a glass. The touch was brief, almost nothing, but it sent a shock through her body that left her breathless. Her first instinct was to pull back, to hide the reaction, but when she glanced up, she saw those familiar eyes watching her, filled with something she didn't dare name. She wanted to speak, to break the moment with words, but she couldn't. The silence between them was louder than anything else. It said everything she wasn't ready to admit. Later, as they walked to the balcony, the night air wrapped around them. The city lights stretched endlessly below, glowing with a brilliance she had seen 1,000 times but never really felt until now. She leaned on the railing, trying to ground herself, but the closeness of the woman beside her made it impossible. Every breath she took seemed shared, every second charged with something she couldn't escape. "You've changed," the woman said softly, not as an accusation but as an observation. She didn't answer right away. What could she say? That she had changed into someone harder, someone colder, someone who had chosen walls over people? Or that deep inside, she hadn't changed at all, that the part of her that once loved freely was still there, buried but desperate to be found again? The truth was both. And in that moment, standing under the stars with someone who had known her before the world did, she felt the weight of both truths pressing down on her. She turned her head and found her gaze waiting, steady and unflinching. It was the same gaze she remembered from years ago, the one that had once made her believe she could be loved as she was. Her chest tightened, and without meaning to, she whispered, "I don't know if I can do this." The words slipped out before she could stop them. But instead of pulling away, the other woman simply smiled, a gentle curve of lips that carried patience and something like promise. "Then don't do it all at once," she replied. The simplicity of that answer unsettled her. She was used to big decisions, sharp choices, all or nothing. But here was someone telling her she didn't need to carry the whole weight in one moment. She could take it piece by piece, step by step. That thought lingered with her long after the night ended. When she finally closed her eyes in bed, the silence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a space filled with possibility, terrifying but alive. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. And for the first time, she realized she wanted to find out. The morning began like any other, sunlight spilling across the glass walls, the city humming below, but she felt restless in a way she hadn't in years. It should have been a normal day, filled with meetings and schedules that left no room for hesitation, but her mind wouldn't settle. She had allowed too much of herself to be seen in recent days, and it unnerved her. Vulnerability had never been safe in her world, not when every smile could hide an agenda, not when every kindness could be followed by betrayal. She had spent years polishing her solitude into armor, and now, with just a few nights of laughter and conversations, cracks had formed. She tried to dive into her work, bury herself in contracts and decisions, but the numbers blurred, the words lost their weight. Every thought looped back to the sound of her laughter echoing in her apartment, to the feeling of her hand brushing against hers, to the memory of those eyes seeing her in a way no one else did. It scared her more than she cared to admit. That fear reached its peak later that day when a crisis struck. A business deal she had been preparing for months suddenly threatened to collapse. Investors grew restless, headlines hinted at weakness, and the empire she had built with precision now trembled under scrutiny. Normally, she thrived in chaos. She had always been the woman who stepped into fire without flinching, but this time something was different. The weight of the situation pressed down harder, not just because of the deal but because of what it meant for her image, her sense of control. She couldn't show cracks, not to the world, not to herself. And yet when she felt the walls closing in, her first instinct wasn't to call her legal team or her advisors, it was to push everyone away, including the one person who had started to matter again. That evening, when she appeared at her door with that quiet smile that always made her feel like she was 17 again, she almost couldn't bear it. She told her it wasn't a good time, that she had too much to handle, that she needed space. The words came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't stop them. The fear of losing control bled into everything, and shutting her out felt safer than risking being seen as weak. For a moment, she thought she would leave. The silence stretched heavy between them, the kind that cuts deeper than shouting. But instead of turning away, she stepped closer. She didn't demand to be let in, didn't press with questions. She simply said, "I'm not here to fix what's broken. I just don't want you to go through it alone." That simple truth landed harder than any speech could have. Still, the part of her that had been trained to survive by isolation fought back. She closed the door, leaning against it as soon as it shut, her breath shaking. The sound of retreating footsteps echoed in her ears long after they were gone. That night was restless. She paced her empty home, the loneliness she had once claimed as strength now clawing at her chest like an enemy. She realized how much had changed. Solitude had once been her shield, her fortress, the proof of her independence. But now it felt like punishment. The silence was heavier than ever, because she knew what it felt like to break it, to let warmth slip in, and she had slammed the door on it. She hated herself for it. She hated the fear that ruled her, the way her heart longed for connection while her mind clung to control. And yet beneath the self-loathing, a thought whispered, she hadn't lost her yet. She pictured her standing on the other side of that door, steady, patient, unwilling to walk away completely. That image haunted her, not with despair but with a fragile kind of hope. The next morning, she caught herself staring at her own reflection, searching her face for the woman she had become. She didn't see the untouchable tycoon splashed across magazine covers. She saw someone tired, someone afraid, someone who had built walls so high she forgot how to climb out of them. And for the first time, she admitted to herself that solitude had stopped being a choice. It had become a prison she didn't know how to escape. The realization left her shaken, but also strangely lighter. Because if solitude wasn't strength anymore, maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward. She didn't know what pushed her to reach out again. Maybe it was the way the silence gnawed at her after shutting the door, or maybe it was the memory of those eyes that refused to leave her mind. Days passed with her pretending to be consumed by business, but the truth was she was consumed by guilt. She had hurt someone who hadn't deserved it, someone who had come not to demand, not to take, but to offer the kind of companionship she had secretly longed for. The weight of that mistake pulled at her chest until she finally gave in and called, her voice steady but her hands trembling as she waited for an answer. When she heard the soft hello on the other end, all the words she had rehearsed dissolved. Instead of an explanation, what came out was silence filled with unspoken apologies. The pause stretched, then she heard that same patient tone, "Do you want me to come over?" She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And that was enough. When the knock came again, it wasn't as startling as the first time. She opened the door with less hesitation, though her heart still pounded. They stood facing each other, and for a moment it felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter everything. But she stepped aside, and this time when the door closed, she didn't regret it. They sat together without rushing into conversation. The silence between them was heavy, but different now. It was filled with questions, with waiting, with the unspoken plea for honesty. Finally, she broke it. Her voice wavered as she admitted how solitude had been her weapon, her shield, the thing she had relied on for survival, but how it had also become her punishment. She confessed that she didn't know how to let someone in anymore, that the walls she built were too high, and sometimes she wasn't sure if she even remembered how to climb down from them. The words felt jagged in her throat, like they were cutting her as she let them out, but once they were free, she felt lighter. She braced herself for judgment, for pity, but none came. Instead, there was only quiet listening, the kind of silence that didn't press, that didn't demand. And then came her voice, steady and warm. She shared her own battles with solitude, how it had shaped her too, how it could heal but also isolate, how it could give space to breathe but also rob you of the air you needed most. She didn't pretend to have answers, didn't try to fix what wasn't hers to fix. She simply spoke her truth, and in doing so, she made the room feel less lonely. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't broken for struggling, that maybe being afraid didn't make her weak, that maybe vulnerability wasn't the enemy. Her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in so long, relief. Their conversation deepened into the kind of honesty that stripped both of them bare. They spoke of fears, of dreams, of love in its most complicated form. They admitted how terrifying it was to trust, to hope, to reach out knowing rejection could come. And yet, underneath the fear, there was something else, something softer, the willingness to try. She found herself watching her hands as she spoke, realizing how much they trembled, not from weakness but from the intensity of wanting to be understood. And when those hands were gently taken, when warm fingers intertwined with hers, it felt like a promise without words. Not a promise of forever, not something grand or impossible, but a promise of presence, of patience, of walking one step at a time. The night stretched on, but it felt different from the others. The air wasn't filled with the excitement of rediscovery or the tension of unspoken longing. It was filled with a quiet truth. They were both afraid, both scarred, but neither wanted to face that fear alone anymore. And as she leaned back, her head resting against the couch, her hands still held tightly, she realized that for the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel like solitude was her only safe place. She felt the warmth of another person beside her, and it didn't feel like weakness. It felt like home. The days that followed unfolded in a way she had never anticipated. For years, her life had been ruled by schedules and numbers, by precision and discipline that left no room for accidents or softness. But now, the routine she once clung to with iron fists began to bend without her realizing it. She found herself leaving meetings earlier than planned, ignoring phone calls she would have once deemed urgent, all because she knew there was someone waiting for her, someone who didn't care about her money, her empire, or the mask she wore for the world. For the first time, she allowed herself to choose something beyond success. At first, their time together was simple. They cooked meals side by side, laughing when they burned the garlic or spilled sauce on the floor. They sat on the couch with books open but unread, because conversation always distracted them. They shared music late into the night, old songs that stirred memories and new ones that made them dream about the future. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations, it was about the quiet rhythm of two people rediscovering what it meant to belong. Yet even in that tenderness, she struggled. There were moments when the instinct to retreat slammed into her like a wave. Sometimes, in the middle of laughter, her mind would remind her of everything she stood to lose if she let this go too far. She would fall silent, her smile fading as fear coiled tight inside her chest. She would excuse herself, retreating into another room just to breathe, just to remind herself she was still in control. And every time, she expected to return and find her gone, tired of waiting, tired of the walls she couldn't let down. But she was always there. Waiting, steady, never pushing harder than she could handle. That patience terrified her as much as it soothed her. Because it meant there was no excuse, no easy way to hide behind her fortress anymore. It meant someone had chosen her as she was, messy, guarded, imperfect. It forced her to confront the truth that maybe she didn't need to keep fighting alone. One night, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunrise, she finally allowed herself to admit out loud what she had only whispered in her mind. She confessed how hard it was to let someone in, how she had convinced herself for years that she didn't need anyone. Her voice cracked as she admitted the emptiness that came with solitude, how it hollowed her from the inside even as it made her appear invincible to the outside world. She waited for judgment, but instead there was only silence, and then the gentle weight of a head resting on her shoulder. That small act broke her more than words ever could. It wasn't pity, it wasn't demand, it was acceptance. It was proof that she didn't have to fix everything, that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved. Slowly, she began to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in the small details that defined her days. She started to cook instead of ordering takeout. She laughed more freely, not the practiced laugh she used in boardrooms but the kind that slipped out unplanned, raw and real. She listened when they spoke, not with half her mind on emails but with her full attention, as if nothing else in the world mattered. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when fear crept back in, when she pulled away without meaning to, when the old voice inside her whispered that love was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness. But she was learning that she didn't have to face those nights alone anymore. And in return, she began to give something back. She started opening up about her own dreams, not the ones measured in profits and power, but the ones she had buried long ago, travel she never took, book she never wrote, a version of herself that had been lost beneath ambition. As she spoke, she watched her eyes light up with encouragement, with belief, with a tenderness that wrapped around her like warmth on a winter night. It was strange and terrifying to feel seen so fully, but it was also freeing. For the first time, she didn't feel like solitude was the price she had to pay for her fortune. She realized she could still have her empire, her success, but she didn't have to sit at the top of it alone. And as she leaned into her side, the sunrise painting the sky in colors too beautiful to ignore, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this was what she had been missing all along, not just love, but the courage to let herself be loved. The days that followed unfolded in a way she had never anticipated. For years, her life had been ruled by schedules and numbers, by precision and discipline that left no room for accidents or softness. But now, the routine she once clung to with iron fists began to bend without her realizing it. She found herself leaving meetings earlier than planned, ignoring phone calls she would have once deemed urgent, all because she knew there was someone waiting for her, someone who didn't care about her money, her empire, or the mask she wore for the world. For the first time, she allowed herself to choose something beyond success. At first, their time together was simple. They cooked meals side by side, laughing when they burned the garlic or spilled sauce on the floor. They sat on the couch with books open but unread, because conversation always distracted them. They shared music late into the night, old songs that stirred memories and new ones that made them dream about the future. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations, it was about the quiet rhythm of two people rediscovering what it meant to belong. Yet even in that tenderness, she struggled. There were moments when the instinct to retreat slammed into her like a wave. Sometimes, in the middle of laughter, her mind would remind her of everything she stood to lose if she let this go too far. She would fall silent, her smile fading as fear coiled tight inside her chest. She would excuse herself, retreating into another room just to breathe, just to remind herself she was still in control. And every time, she expected to return and find her gone, tired of waiting, tired of the walls she couldn't let down. But she was always there. Waiting, steady, never pushing harder than she could handle. That patience terrified her as much as it soothed her. Because it meant there was no excuse, no easy way to hide behind her fortress anymore. It meant someone had chosen her as she was, messy, guarded, imperfect. It forced her to confront the truth that maybe she didn't need to keep fighting alone. One night, as they sat on the balcony watching the sunrise, she finally allowed herself to admit out loud what she had only whispered in her mind. She confessed how hard it was to let someone in, how she had convinced herself for years that she didn't need anyone. Her voice cracked as she admitted the emptiness that came with solitude, how it hollowed her from the inside even as it made her appear invincible to the outside world. She waited for judgment, but instead there was only silence, and then the gentle weight of a head resting on her shoulder. That small act broke her more than words ever could. It wasn't pity, it wasn't demand, it was acceptance. It was proof that she didn't have to fix everything, that she didn't have to be perfect to be loved. Slowly, she began to change. Not in a dramatic way, but in the small details that defined her days. She started to cook instead of ordering takeout. She laughed more freely, not the practiced laugh she used in boardrooms but the kind that slipped out unplanned, raw and real. She listened when they spoke, not with half her mind on emails but with her full attention, as if nothing else in the world mattered. It wasn't easy. There were still nights when fear crept back in, when she pulled away without meaning to, when the old voice inside her whispered that love was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness. But she was learning that she didn't have to face those nights alone anymore. And in return, she began to give something back. She started opening up about her own dreams, not the ones measured in profits and power, but the ones she had buried long ago, travel she never took, books she never wrote, a version of herself that had been lost beneath ambition. As she spoke, she watched her eyes light up with encouragement, with belief, with a tenderness that wrapped around her like warmth on a winter night. It was strange and terrifying to feel seen so fully, but but it was also freeing. For the first time, she didn't feel like solitude was the price she had to pay for her fortune. She realized she could still have her empire, her success, but she didn't have to sit at the top of it alone. And as she leaned into her side, the sunrise painting the sky in colors too beautiful to ignore, she allowed herself to believe that maybe this was what she had been missing all along, not just love, but the courage to let herself be loved. The peace they had built together began to feel almost fragile, like glass that shimmered beautifully but could shatter with the slightest pressure. For a while, she ignored the warning signs. She convinced herself that what they had found inside her home was untouchable, that as long as they stayed in that cocoon of quiet dinners, late-night conversations, and sunrises shared in silence, the outside world could not interfere. But the world had a way of knocking harder than anyone else ever could, and soon enough, reality pushed its way in. The trouble began with a headline. Her name splashed across the morning news, rumors about a collapsing deal that she had been holding together by threads. Investors panicked, competitors circled like wolves, and the empire she had spent a lifetime building suddenly looked vulnerable. The calls came in waves, angry, desperate, demanding. She handled them with the sharp voice she was known for, the voice that could command entire rooms into silence, but underneath the steel was panic she couldn't hide from herself. In the middle of that storm, she felt the shift inside her. Fear whispered that she couldn't afford distractions, that she couldn't afford to let anyone see her weak, not even the one person who had been patient enough to wait through all her storms. Old habits returned with frightening ease. She stopped answering calls she didn't want to take. She retreated into her office, locking herself behind doors that had once made her feel powerful but now only made her feel trapped. And worst of all, she began pulling away from the only presence that had made her life feel less hollow. She told herself it was to protect them, to keep them from the mess her world was about to become. But deep down she knew the truth, it was fear. Fear of being seen at her weakest. Fear that if they looked too closely, they would decide she wasn't worth the fight. So she did what she always did, she shut the door. The first time she saw the hurt in her eyes, it nearly broke her. They stood in the living room, the air heavy with words unsaid. "You don't have to face this alone," she whispered gently. But the answer came out sharp, colder than she intended. "I do. That's how I've always survived." The silence that followed was unbearable. It wasn't the comforting silence they had once shared, the kind that held warmth and unspoken promises. This silence was suffocating, thick with distance. She turned away before she could see the disappointment, before she could let herself break completely. That night, the emptiness returned with a vengeance. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the quiet pressing down on her chest until it was hard to breathe. For years she had told herself solitude was strength, that being alone meant being untouchable. But now the solitude tasted bitter, cruel, like punishment for something she hadn't yet figured out how to fix. She thought of them, waiting patiently on the other side of her walls, and the thought twisted in her chest. She had everything, wealth, power, control, but none of it could fill the space they left behind. The empire she had built felt like sand slipping through her hands, and what terrified her most wasn't the idea of losing it all. What terrified her most was the idea of losing them. Days blurred into nights as the crisis outside grew louder, but inside her home, a different battle raged. Each time she heard footsteps in the hallway or the soft knock on her door, she felt the urge to open it, to admit she couldn't do it alone. But every time, fear won. She stayed silent, hiding in the shadows of her own fortress. And yet, no matter how many times she pushed them away, they didn't leave. They lingered, patient, a steady presence on the edges of her storm. That unwavering patience burned more than anger ever could. Because it meant she was the one keeping herself prisoner, she was the one choosing solitude over love, she was the one holding the key and refusing to use it. One evening, after another day of snapping at everyone who dared speak to her, she found herself standing by the door, her hand hovering over the handle. On the other side, she imagined them sitting quietly, waiting, maybe even hurting because of her silence. The thought sent a pain through her chest so sharp it made her breath catch. She realized then that solitude wasn't protecting her anymore. It was destroying her. It had given her fortune, yes, but it was also about to cost her the only thing that had ever truly mattered. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry. The tears came fast, heavy, unstoppable. Not the kind of tears that solved anything, but the kind that stripped her bare, leaving her raw and human in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be in years. And when the sobs finally quieted, she knew something had to change. She couldn't keep hiding. She couldn't keep pretending that solitude was her strength when it was the very thing tearing her apart. But even as she knew this, fear lingered. She stayed by the door, her hand still trembling on the handle, her heart caught between the life she had always known and the love she was terrified to lose. And in that moment, she realized the choice was hers. The night she finally opened the door, the world seemed to pause around her. For hours she had stood there, her hand pressed against the cold wood, her breath shallow as doubts swarmed her mind. What if it was too late? What if she had already pushed them so far away that there was no return? The fear nearly dragged her back into silence, but the thought of spending another night alone, trapped inside the prison of her own making, was unbearable. With a trembling hand, she turned the handle, and the door gave way. On the other side, they sat quietly, curled up on the couch with a blanket draped over their shoulders, eyes tired but still soft. The sight of them hit her harder than any failure, harder than any headline. They weren't angry, they weren't accusing, they were simply there, waiting, as though their presence was enough to remind her that she wasn't as alone as she thought. The first words out of her mouth cracked under the weight of her fear. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to go on. "I don't know how to let someone stay. I've spent my whole life believing solitude was strength, but it's not. It's just empty. And I can't keep living like that. Not when I know what it feels like to have you here." The silence stretched for a long moment, her heart hammering in her chest, until finally they set the blanket aside and crossed the room. Their hands found hers, warm and steady, grounding her when her whole body felt like it might collapse under the weight of her confession. "Then don't do it alone anymore," they whispered gently. That simple sentence broke through every wall she had ever built. She collapsed into their arms, the tears flowing freely as though she had been holding them back for years. And instead of shame, instead of weakness, she felt relief. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean, to be vulnerable, to be loved without conditions. In that embrace, the storm inside her quieted. The days that followed were not suddenly perfect. The business world still demanded her attention, and the empire she had built still came with battles to fight. But something within her had shifted. She no longer shut the door when the weight grew heavy. Instead, she reached for the hand that steadied her. She began to understand that strength wasn't about standing alone, it was about choosing who stood beside her when the world grew too loud. Slowly, the fortress she had built around her life began to change. The office lights no longer burned deep into the night because she learned to step away, to share dinners and laughter instead of drowning in endless work. Her house, once silent and cold, began to feel alive with warmth. Music played in the evenings, conversations flowed freely, and the sound of laughter replaced the echoes of solitude. It wasn't just that she had found love, it was that she had allowed herself to be loved, flaws and fears included. And in that acceptance, she discovered a version of herself she thought she had lost long ago. A woman who could dream, not just of success, but of joy. A woman who could smile without calculation, who could wake up to the sight of someone beside her and not feel panic but peace. One evening, as they sat together watching the city lights from the balcony, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The fortune she once thought demanded her solitude had nearly consumed her, but it had also led her to this moment. For the first time, she realized her wealth didn't have to be the price she paid for love, it could be a foundation to build something greater. Not an empire of loneliness, but a life filled with connection, trust, and the kind of love that made every battle worth fighting. She turned to them, their face illuminated by the glow of the city, and felt a swell of gratitude so deep it ached. "You knocked down more than my door," she whispered softly. "You broke through everything I thought I had to be. And I don't ever want to go back." They smiled, leaning in close, their forehead touching hers. "Then we'll move forward together." And in that moment, she knew that solitude no longer defined her. It had shaped her, yes, but it no longer held her captive. She had chosen love over fear, connection over walls, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel empty. She felt whole. The empire was still hers, but now she didn't stand at the top alone. She stood hand in hand with someone who had seen her at her weakest and stayed anyway. And that, more than any fortune, was the richest life she could ever imagine.